a man fled from his own newborn son, and what made him flee was neither an illness nor a defect. What made him flee was that the boy was too perfect, too radiant, too different from any human. That is not found in any popular legend, nor in any modern interpretation by a contemporary theologian. It is written word for word in a document found in caves in the Judean desert in 1947. That document is over 2,000 years old and is one of the 7 original Dead Sea Scrolls. It is called the Apocryphal Genesis, and the scholars who first read it took decades to publish its content. What that text says about the birth of Noah completely contradicts what religious tradition teaches. And when you understand exactly what it says, the reason for the flood will change irreversibly for you. But there is something you need to understand before getting to the content of the text and the story of the birth itself. This document was not discovered by chance. It was found because a Bedouin shepherd threw a stone into a cave. That stone broke something in the darkness. He went in to see what it was and found sealed jars with scrolls inside. They were the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the most complete of the 7 originals was the one that began with the birth of Noah. Before understanding the child, you need to understand why this document was preserved with such care for centuries. The Qumran community dedicated their entire life to the study and preservation of texts they considered sacred. They were disciplined scribes who did not copy just anything, only what they considered authentic and vital. And they chose to copy the Book of Enoch in multiple versions, which means they considered it completely valid. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church also preserved it in its official biblical canon for over 1,500 years. That is not a marginal curiosity. It is confirmation that 2 independent traditions considered it essential. The Book of Enoch, chapter 106, describes 5 specific physical characteristics of the child Noah at the moment of his birth. And the apocryphal Genesis of Qumran confirms those same 5 characteristics with the exact same words from the text. This is called cross-documentary confirmation, and it is what distinguishes this account from a simple mythical narrative. There is a detail that most people do not know. The Bible dedicates exactly 2 sentences to describing Noah. 2 sentences, and both only say that he was a just man, without any other details about his person or his origin. But the texts removed from the official Bible, those kept in Qumran, describe something completely different. They describe a birth so extraordinary that the father himself could not accept that the child was his in any way. Noah's father was named Lamech, and when he saw his newborn son, he stepped back in terror, unable to explain why. The first characteristic was that the child's body was white as snow and at the same time red as a living rose. The Qumran fragment uses exactly that combination of words, white as snow and red as a rose, without any change. In the context of the ancient Near East, that description did not correspond to any known human child in the region. The second characteristic was that her hair was completely white, like wool from the very moment of her birth. It is neither a metaphor nor a poetic device. The text lists it as a concrete and observable physical characteristic. The third characteristic is that when the child opened his eyes for the first time, the entire room lit up like the sun. The father himself described that light as something that filled the entire house, emanating directly from the child's eyes. Not from a window, not from any lamp, but from the eyes of that newborn in the midwife's arms. Lamech looked at his son and said, "According to the text, this is not a child. This is something completely different from a human." The apocryphal Genesis records that phrase almost exactly. And it is precisely that phrase that triggers the story. But the fourth and fifth characteristics are the ones that transform the entire meaning of the flood narrative. Feature 4. When the child came out of the midwife's arms, he opened his mouth and spoke directly to God. He did not cry like any newborn. He spoke, and the text is absolutely specific and unambiguous on that point. The document states that at the moment he emerged from the hands of the midwife, he spoke to the Lord of Justice directly. Not days later, not weeks later, at that precise moment according to the Qumran text that no one has ever refuted. Feature 5 is the one that made Lamech leave the house and run without stopping until the ends of the earth. Not the eyes that lit up the room, not the white hair, but specifically the fifth and final characteristic. The Book of Enoch describes it in a single sentence that changes everything. Its form and type are not like that of a man. Not an isolated trait, not a specific peculiarity. Its complete form, its entire type, explicitly declared as non-human. 5 independently documented characteristics in the Book of Enoch and in the apocryphal Genesis of Qumran. 2 separate texts, 2 different traditions, exactly the same details with no significant variation between them. That convergence is not a textual coincidence. It is the confirmation that historians seek before taking a text seriously. And that is exactly the level of confirmation that the account of Noah's birth has in the Qumran documents. Now think about what it means that those 5 traits have been preserved with such precision for so many centuries. It means that someone considered that information important enough to copy it over and over again without altering it. It means that this information had a purpose beyond historical record. It had a function that transcends its time. Lamech didn't know what to do with what he had seen, so he ran to the ends of the earth to find Enoch. Enoch was his great-grandfather and lived withdrawn from the world in a place that the text describes as the ends of the earth. Lamech did not ask what name to give the child or what future this extraordinary and different being would have. He asked her one thing, direct and terrified. Is this child mine, or is he from the angels in heaven? That question from a father about his own newborn son is what opens the apocryphal Genesis in its first section. The most preserved document of the 7 original Dead Sea Scrolls begins exactly with that question. And before reaching Enoch's response, the text records something that almost no preacher or teacher mentions. Noah's mother, named Bitonosh in the Hebrew text, had to personally defend her fidelity before Lamech. He did not believe that the child was his because the child resembled absolutely nothing of any known human being. The apocryphal Genesis records his defense word for word, which shows that the text describes a real experience. It is a moment of family tension, documented in a scroll of over 2,000 years, found in the Judean desert. That intimate and human detail is one of the clearest indicators that the text is not constructing an allegory. Then Enoch answered Lamech, and his response is precisely the part that was removed from modern translations. It was not removed from the Dead Sea Scrolls. They preserved it intact for over 2,000 years without alteration. It was removed from all major biblical translations, all sermons, and all Sunday school teachings. Enoch said to Lamech very clearly, "This son is yours, but listen to why his appearance is so different. In your father Jared's generation, some of the angels from heaven descended to earth and took physical form. And what those angels began in that generation did not end with the flood. Its effects continued beyond the water." Stop here for a moment, because this is what completely changes the way the entire story is understood. Enoch did not tell Lamech, "Your son is an angel," or "Your son descends directly from the angels of heaven." He told her something much more specific. The genetic contamination initiated by the Watchers produced effects that persisted. This means that Noah carried in his own body the visible markers of what the text calls the vigilant inheritance. And Enoch added something that no modern translation reproduces, was chosen exactly for that reason, not despite it. Not despite its different and bright appearance, but precisely because that appearance revealed something about its lineage. That is the true meaning of Enoch's response, and it is the meaning that no modern translation faithfully reproduces. There is no denial in that response of an origin different from Noah. There is an explanation of why that origin was necessary. Noah was not anomalous by accident. He was different because the contamination of the lineage produced those visible markers in him. And God chose him precisely because those markers indicated that his Toledoth, his genetic line, had remained intact. Now connect this with Genesis 6-4, the verse that Moses wrote, with two words that no one in the tradition explains. Those two words in Hebrew are, and also afterwards, deliberately placed at the end of the verse about the Nephilim. Genesis 6-5, the verse immediately following that of the Nephilim, states that the thoughts of every human were corrupt. But Genesis 6-9 says that Noah was perfect in his generations, using a very specific Hebrew word for that. That word is Toledoth, and Toledoth in biblical Hebrew does not mean virtue, behavior, or religious obedience. Toledoth means lineage, means chain of descent, means the genetic line that connects one generation to another. Moses wrote that Noah was perfect in his Toledoth, in his lineage, not in his conduct or in his daily actions. In 6 Hebrew words, Moses is saying exactly that Noah was chosen because his genetics had not been altered. The flood was not a widespread moral punishment. It was a specific intervention regarding a problem of genetic contamination. And if that is what the text is saying, then the two words, and also later in Genesis 6-4, become serious. Because those two words directly mean that after the flood, genetic contamination returned to the earth. The flood renewed the dominant population, but didn't fully erase the pattern Moses referred to as the contamination of the Toledoth. Moses knew this and encoded it in the same verse where he describes the Nephilim existing before the universal flood. I was not just describing what had happened before the water. I was warning about what would continue to happen afterwards. And the evidence that this happened exactly as Moses warned does not come only from biblical texts or Jewish Apocrypha. It comes from 3 completely independent civilizations that had no contact with each other during their foundational periods. The first is Sumeria, the oldest known civilization, which emerged within 200 years after the flood. Sumerian texts describe the Apkallu, the 7 sages who brought knowledge and civilization to humanity. They were luminous beings with white skin and shining eyes who appeared after a great universal primordial flood. These characteristics match exactly with the 5 from the Book of Enoch, chapter 106, without any adaptation needed. Egypt is the second civilization, and its texts describe the Shemsu Hor, called the followers of Horus in translation. They were the pre-dynastic rulers, recorded in the Turin royal list as beings of a nature different from human. The Egyptian text uses the word Netjeru for them, which specifically means divine beings of a category distinct from human. Greece is the third civilization, and Hesiod in the Theogony describes the Titans as the divine race that preceded everything. Luminous, of extraordinary size and nature, different from both the gods of Olympus and ordinary men. And crucially, the Greek text specifies that they were not destroyed, but imprisoned underground after their final defeat. Sumeria, Egypt, and Greece developed as civilizations completely independently in their foundational centuries. There is no known route of cultural transmission that connects their foundational myths during the periods in which they were formed. And yet the three describe exactly the same beings with exactly the same specific physical characteristics. That is not cultural transmission or mutual influence. That is what historians call collective memory of a real event. Three civilizations independently remembering the same beings that Moses described in Genesis 6-4, exactly. The same beings with the same 5 characteristics that Enoch recorded when describing the extraordinary birth of Noah. This confirms what Moses encoded in 2 words. The flood restarted, but did not eliminate the pattern of the watchers. The dominant population was replaced by water, but the carriers of the different Toledoth survived dispersed. And those bearers became the foundational figures of each major civilization that emerged after the waters. Moses saw this coming with total clarity when he inserted it, and also later as an active warning in Genesis 6-4. He didn't write it with resignation, but with the precision of someone who understood exactly what had happened before the water. Because Moses knew the tradition of the Book of Enoch and was aware of the complete account of the different birth of Noah. I knew why Noah had that distinct look. I knew exactly what Noah's perfect Toledoth meant. And in Numbers 13, when the spies returned from Canaan describing giants, Moses showed no surprise at that. The spies said verbatim, "We were like locusts before them," and they themselves looked that way in our own eyes. Those giants of Canaan were the exact continuation of the pattern that Moses had already deliberately codified in Genesis 6-4. The same pattern that continued to advance through Sumeria, Egypt, and Greece with completely identical physical markers. And this is where history stops being just ancient history and becomes something that directly affects current reading. Because what Jesus said in Matthew 24:37 connects everything we have covered with a specific future point of convergence. Jesus said with direct words that as it was in the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man among us. He did not say how it was morally in those days. He did not say how it was in terms of the level of sin of that specific generation. He stated it as it was, without any additional qualifiers, pointing out the concrete conditions of that historical era directly. In the context of Second Temple Judaism, it referred to the complete set of conditions of that period. A set that includes the pattern of Genesis 6-4, the pattern that Moses codified precisely with, and also afterwards. The same pattern with the 5 physical characteristics that Enoch documented in detail regarding the extraordinary birth of Noah. If Jesus was only pointing to moral corruption, he would have used the Aramaic word for impiety or for widespread violence. But he used the expression as it was, that in his Second Temple cultural context, it pointed to the complete event of that era. And that complete event includes the pattern of the Watchers, the contaminated Toledoth, and the 5 characteristics of Enoch 106. But there is something more that Jesus said in that same discourse that reinforces the connection with Noah's specific birth. He said that in those days, people ate, drank, and got married completely unaware of what was happening around them. That description is not of extreme immorality. It is of absolute normality that coexists with a pattern that no one is seeing. Exactly like the contemporaries of Noah, who lived their lives without recognizing the pattern that Noah had indeed recognized. Jesus was not describing an era of visible chaos. He was describing an era where the pattern acts without being recognized. And that is precisely the instruction of the three Gregorian texts. It is not necessary when the danger is obvious to everyone. Now, there are three distinct sources from three completely different historical periods pointing to the same central pattern. Enoch in the apocryphal texts, Moses in the canonical Pentateuch, Jesus in the synoptic Gospels of the New Testament. Three voices that did not know each other, separated by centuries, describing the same pattern with the same exact precision. And the three voices not only agree in describing the pattern, but also in indicating exactly what the response should be. The answer is not to fight the pattern with physical force, nor is it to flee from it as Lamech fled from his own newborn son. Enoch told Lamech, "The Lord will do new things on the earth, and I have already seen them in a vision before they happened." The response that Enoch conveys is the active awareness of recognizing what is happening before everyone else sees it. Not the passive awareness of one who simply knows, but the awareness of one who acts from what they have truly understood. Noah was chosen because his Toledoth was untainted, and because he recognized the pattern surrounding him when no one else could see it. Not because he was the strongest, not because he was the most powerful, but because his perception remained completely intact. Moses repeated the same principle in Deuteronomy 31-6, with a single, very precise and completely deliberate Hebrew word. The word is chazak, and it does not mean physical strength, but something much more specific and relevant to the context of the pattern. It means to hold firmly to what you know is true when everyone around you has stopped seeing it clearly. Maintain a firm understanding of what is happening when the pattern acts and the majority has lost the ability to see it. And Jesus said exactly the same in Matthew 24, immediately after using the days of Noah as a direct prophetic reference. His instruction was a single Greek word, Gregoreo, which means to stay awake and alert at all times. It was not a long or complex instruction, it was a single word, because the principle is as simple as it is difficult to maintain. It does not mean to fight the pattern, it does not mean to escape from it, it means to keep the perception active when it appears. Three sources separated by 3,000 years of temporal distance, giving the exact same instruction about the same central pattern. Noah's birth, with its 5 characteristics, was not recorded as a curious anecdote about an extraordinary baby. It is the foundational document that explains why the flood occurred, what caused it, and why the problem did not end with the water. And that document was deliberately preserved for 2,000 years, sealed in the caves of the Judean desert without alteration. The Ethiopian church kept it in its official canon, and the scribes of Qumran copied it in multiple complete versions. 2 completely independent traditions made the same decision. This cannot be lost. This must arrive. Not as a historical curiosity, but as functional information for a specific moment that those preservers anticipated. The apocryphal Genesis opens with the question of a terrified father. Is this child mine, or is it from the angels of heaven? The 5 characteristics of Noah, the perfect Toledoth, the 2 words of Moses, and the Gregoro of Jesus point to the same place. Everything converges towards the same point that Enoch had already seen in his vision long before Lamech came to ask him. Noah was not a man who survived the flood because he built a vessel more solid than those of his contemporaries. He was chosen because in the midst of a generation that had stopped seeing the pattern, he still recognized it with total clarity. That capacity for recognition, that intact Toledoth in its perception, is exactly what the three texts are conveying. And the three transmit it because at some point that pattern that Moses encoded in 6 Hebrew words will reactivate. Lamech fled from his son because what he saw in that cradle completely surpassed his ability to comprehend at that moment. The truth before his eyes was that this angelic-looking child was the visible answer to massive contamination. The flood was not the story of how humanity was destroyed by its general wickedness and then replaced by a family. It was the story of how a specific lineage was preserved because its Toledoth had remained unaltered in the face of the pattern. The 2 words that Moses inserted in Genesis 6-4 are the quietest and most precise warning of the entire biblical text. They mean that the problem that caused the flood did not end with the waters, but continued to advance after them. Through Sumeria with the Apkallu, through Egypt with the Shemsu-Hor, through Greece with the Luminous Titans. Always with the same markers, always with the same 5 characteristics that Enoch recorded at Noah's birth in chapter 106. And there is no alternative explanation that withstands analysis when the 3 textual corpora are placed side by side. It is not cultural borrowing because the contact routes did not exist in the foundational periods of those 3 civilizations. It is not a universal psychological archetype because archetypes do not produce identical physical descriptions in isolated cultures. The only explanation that encompasses the 3 sets of data is that the 3 civilizations were remembering the same reality. And if they are remembering the same reality, then what Moses codified in, and also afterwards, is not theology, it is exact history. And if Jesus in Matthew 24 pointed to that specific pattern, the question that remains is not just historical, nor just academic. The question is whether those markers, those 5 characteristics, that different Toledoth, are recognizable in the present time. Enoch saw in vision what was to come. Moses codified it in text with precision. Jesus referred to it as a direct prophetic reference. The 3 said, "Don't run like Lamech did. Keep your eyes open and recognize the pattern when it's right in front of you. Stay strong in what you know is true, even if everyone around you has stopped seeing it clearly enough." Gregoro remains awake and alert because the Master returns exactly as described in the text 3,000 years ago. The birth of Noah with his 5 angelic characteristics was recorded because that birth contains a complete code. A code that explains what happened before the flood, what happened afterward, and what the 3 texts say will happen. The man who fled from his son that night was the first to see without being able to understand what Enoch had already comprehended. The information before his eyes was so precise and so specific that it paralyzed him instead of enlightening him completely. 2,000 years later, that same information is available to anyone who wants to read the texts in their original form. The texts raise the question not of past existence of the pattern, but the 3 corpora confirm it did exist. The texts raise the question of whether the teachings of the 3, Chazak and Gregoro, and Enoch's warning are being followed. Lamech and Noah differed not in genetics, position, or power, but solely in their active perception of the world. One fled from what he could not understand, the other recognized the pattern and acted from that understanding with total precision. If this knowledge changed the way you read Genesis 6, subscribe to discover the texts that were hidden.